The main mission of Baha'u'llah is to establish the oneness of humanity in the revelation. He brings a religious dispensation that lasts 1,000 years, the Baha'i dispensation, until another manifestation of God will appear. But Baha'u'llah also inaugurates the 5,000 century Baha'i cycle, which is 500,000 years process that humanity will go to, a refining and evolving in human evolution to understand the oneness of humanity. In the other revelations, we have a concept of this, of the Holy Temple. Solomon built a temple. Before that, we have the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is an ancient temple. And in the Bible, in the Old Testament of the Jews, and the New Testament of the Christians that were written by the letters and epistles by Paul and Peter and the apostles of Jesus, who also had a Jewish background, they speak of the body of believers as the temple. A lot of people consider their own body to be a temple, such as in the Bob's writings, he talks about the throne of the inner temple being the mystery of a human being. So in the Baha'i faith, similar, we have the same idea that the Spirit of God, which the Jews call the Shekinah, the indwelling spirit or presence of God, is embodied in the body of believers or the tribes of Israel. And in the book of Isaiah, it says that God shall call Israel by its new name, Bahai, or Israel by its new name of glory. So the House of Justice for Baha'is, from the revelation of Baha'u'llah, pertains to Baha'u'llah's mission of the Heikel, or the temple, and the outer sanctuary, or the porch at the outer sanctuary before we get in the Holy of Holies at Solomon's temple in Hebrew is also called a Heikel. So the Universal House of Justice is really all of the Baha'i people. Every single person who's a Baha'i under the provision of the covenant should consider themselves a member of the House of Justice, meaning, like Paul states, do you not know that you are the living stones in the temple of God, and the Spirit of God dwelleth within you? And the Apostle Peter also states that you are living stones in the temple of God. So these temples built out of stone are symbolic of the people being living stones who come together and form the unified body of believers. And the way this will work in its final mature stage is all of the Baha'i people that are part of the World House of Justice are able to elect local House of Justice. They're also able to elect a representative to go to a regional or national convention and elect the national or regional House of Justice. And then all of the members of the national Houses of Justice around the world are able to get together, and they will elect the international or universal House of Justice proper, the way people understand that today. But this universal House of Justice is not a separate entity from the rank and file body of believers. All of the body of believers are part of this ark of salvation in the covenant administration, this ark being the House of Justice. So it's elected in 3 stages, and we have delegates, a national election, and a universal election. And Abdul-Baha states the reason that the election has threefold is that it corresponds with the ringstone symbol that the Baha'is know about, that has an upper world, the Olami Haq, the world of God, a middle world, Olami Aimer, the world of command, an intermediary world between God, the world of God above it, and then as above, so below, Olami Kalk, the world of creation. And this symbol is formed by two letter H's forming the top world and two letter H's forming the bottom world. The top world being Olami Hak, the world of God, and the bottom world being the Olami Kalk, the world of creation. So this is similar to the Ark of Noah that had three levels or decks on it. The lowest deck, the middle part, and then the upper deck. And so the Universal House of Justice for the Baha'is under the provisions of the covenant, as Abdul-Baha revealed it and Abdul-Baha delineated it, was implemented by Shoghi Effendi in a four-stage constitution, where it would go from an appointed body to becoming a recognized court, to then being an elected supreme tribunal, and eventually effloresce as all the nations and peoples of the world become aware of this and get in on the act into the International House of Justice or the Universal House of Justice. And the descendant of David in the Baha'i covenant is a point of unity that's the irremovable member for life and the chairperson of this international council, the Universal House of Justice. So during Shoghi Effendi's lifetime, he appointed the people to be on what he called the first International Baha'i Council, and it was embryonic. The reason it's embryonic, like a baby in its mother's womb in an embryo, is that it never had a meeting and it never took a breath, in other words. But at the moment of the passing on of Shoghi Effendi on November 4th of 1957, that first International Baha'i Council should have been activated as Shoghi Effendi's successor, again, being the Universal House of Justice. The Baha'i Faith's the only religion in the world based on a legal document. The Kitab-i-Ad, which is the last will and testament of Baha'u'llah, or the Book of the Everlasting Covenant, the Kitab-i-Ad, and the sacred will and testament of Abdul-Baha, which delineates Baha'u'llah's covenant. And it shows us how the Davidic kingship, or the branches, or the Agsan guardianship, is the continuation of the ancient throne line of King David and Solomon through the exiled monarchs of King David, or the exilarchs, the monarchs of David in exile, in Arabic, Ras al-Jalut, or Hebrew Resh Galutha, meaning the head of the exile. So this is an ancient sign of God, that God never makes the promise, but that he keeps it. That God promised that the throne line of King David would never lack a man to be seated on that throne, and it would be established for an everlasting covenant. But the purpose of this is to be a sign of God, by which we can recognize the true congregation of true believers and the true community, and they all, each and every member, is part and parcel of the House of Justice. So when we say Universal House of Justice, in our thinking, we're including the local houses of justice, the regional and national houses of justice, and the International House of Justice. And the whole system, when we have the dual inheritance of the being of the rod of iron, the spiritual successorship to Baha'u'llah, and the descendant of David of the rod of wood, the genealogical or material successorship to the throne of David, which is a legal inheritance, when this wood and iron come together, it forms what Abdul-Baha calls an infallible rod of gold. And this system of infallibility isn't understood by the majority of the people due to a lack of education and understanding. In some answer questions, Abdul-Baha explains that infallibility is a quality and attribute of God, just like any other quality and attribute of God. Love, justice, generosity, concord, fidelity, harmony, knowledge, wisdom, artisanship as skills. And he says that anybody can acquire the perfections of infallibility in their own mission or in their own life's work that God has created them to fulfill. And he talks about how a doctor in healing arts can attain a station of infallibility in that work, or a ship's captain can attain the station of infallibility in that work. So each one of the believers, when they live the life, teach the faith, and affirm in the covenant, receive their rays of the Holy Spirit, and this is how they acquire these perfections of God, including infallibility in their own life's work and in their own decisions. So the infallibility concept that we have in the Baha'i faith includes all the members of the human family that are considered to be one temple of God, or one universal system, which we call, instead of calling it like the universal system of the human body with 9 systems functioning within it, like the brain and the central nervous system, the heart and the circulatory system, the skeletal system, the digestive system, the immune system. We find that there's 9 systems in the physical body, the same way there's 9 revelators in the cycle of Adam that was 6,000 years, represented by the pyramid, which is also a symbol of the human temple, having 4 foundation corners, and the 5th top being the capstone, is similar to the human temple with a head and a body and 2 arms and 2 legs. And so this internal spirit is within all the people, the Shekinah, the indwelling spirit. When a person receives their rays of the Holy Spirit from God, the one true invisible God, through firmness in the covenant, living the life and teaching the faith, they receive infallible divine guidance through the power of the covenant that sustains the universe and everything in it. And they're able to elect their local council and a local representative that will eventually elect the regional or national or then the international council. So in the 4-stage constitution of Shoghi Effendi, the embryonic International Baha'i Council is, according to Shoghi Effendi, the first stage of development of what will eventually be the fully elected Universal House of Justice for all the people of the world. And this 4th stage of its development will come after stage 3, which is the election of the Supreme Tribunal. Now, this election of the Supreme Tribunal, according to Abdul Baha, includes the governments and the congresses and parliaments of the member nation states of the world ratifying the people who are elected to this. And this is important because the Supreme Tribunal is the instrument which will bring peace to the world. It's the instrument of the lesser peace. So this means that the Baha'is will help establish the lesser peace in the world, or what's called the Great Peace, Akbar, peace of our day, by leading this example of staying firm in the covenant and understanding the mystery of the successorship in the will and testament of Abdul Baha and the covenant of Baha'u'llah. Now, Shoghi Effendi didn't actually appoint Mason Remy. In the letter of January 9th of 1951, where he announces the 4-stage constitution of the First International Baha'i Council / Universal House of Justice, he sends out another letter on May 2nd after that, and he welcomes Mason Remy as the president. He didn't appoint him. Why would he welcome Mason Remy? Well, Shoghi Effendi's unique. He was not just the guardian of the Baha'i faith after Abdul Baha, but he's also the individually conferred infallible successor to Abdul Baha that Abdul Baha names in the Sacred Will and Testament of Shoghi Effendi was named in there by name to be the executor of Abdul Baha's estate. The executor of an estate makes sure that the inheritance from the legacy of the inheritor, that he makes sure that the inheritance goes specifically to the people who are meant to bequeath that inheritance. And this inheritance in Baha'u'llah's covenant, it's an individual inheritance that each and every person in the world receives, which is their own rays of the Holy Spirit and this divine guidance and the spiritual transformation and perfection of themselves. Now, the positions that we might hold, the outer positions in the administration, is not the same thing as our station. Our station, Macam, like a musical station, is the spiritual perfection of ourselves as individuals. But a position is something we hold in outer society. And in the Baha'i world, people kept getting confused and mixing up position versus station. They thought if they had a position in the administration at the days of Shoghi Effendi, that they were saved and they could do no wrong and that they were protected in this way. But these are just outer positions. And even the presidency of the Universal House of Justice, which is what the guardianship is now confined to the presidency of the International Council, is a position in the faith. But the station is the spiritual perfection and the spiritual growth of the individual person in their private and subjective relationship with God, that no human being and no institution can come between the individual and their worship and relationship with the one true invisible God. If something comes between the people and their understanding of the one true invisible God, their station and the perfection of themselves will be thwarted. So this covenant's unique because in Baha'u'llah's Kitab-i-Yad, he names two individual successors, Abdul Baha and then Shoghi Effendi fulfills the second slot, and then the group. And people aren't used to this. They're used to some individual person being the only successor that's authoritative or makes all the decisions, or something that the other people should follow in a way that we see in Judaism and Christianity and Islam is more like blind faith, blind leadership, or taqlid, which is forbidden in the Quran. Instead, the Baha'i revelation appears within the mirror of the souls of the individual believers, as stated by Baha'u'llah in the hidden words, thy heart is my home, sanctify it for my descent. The spirit is my place of revelation, cleanse it for my manifestation. So the manifestation of God appears within the mirror of the souls of the believers who turn toward the Sun of Reality. And the metal that's associated with the golden light of the sun is the metal gold. And it's also symbolic of electricity. Like when we put a carbon rod, which is from wood, carbon's from wood, with the metal filings in a battery of iron or zinc, when we have wood and iron come together, it produces that flow of electrical current. And the flow of current is considered what we're talking about symbolically, the power of the covenant. And the same way electricity is energized and powerful and infallible in what it does, we receive an infallible guidance and an infallible inspiration from God as individuals. And it says that knowledge is the light that God casts in the heart of whom he wills. So we have to have a science of parliamentary procedure. We use Robert's Rules of Order and the Baha'i consultation and Shoghi Effendi's 5 steps of Baha'i consultation, so that the minority or the individual or other people with different points of view are able to obtain the floor and speak, so we can hear and fully air out every issue and trouble and problem that might confront us. So Shoghi Effendi welcomes Masonry presidency, because in 1921 in November, Shoghi Effendi invited Masonry to the Holy Land, and he read him the Will and Testament that he translated into English. That'd be 100 years ago this November coming up. And he gave him his personal inheritance, which is Abdul Baha's son, was the throne of King David. Abdul Baha adopted and appointed Masonry to the throne of King David. So Shoghi Effendi didn't really have a choice in this matter. In order to be firm in the covenant, Shoghi Effendi had to fulfill his mission to implement the Universal House of Justice that Baha'u'llah revealed the way Abdul Baha delineated it. And that meant that Shoghi Effendi had to form the first International Baha'i Council when he appointed it, with Abdul Baha's Agsan son as the president of this, and he did this on May 2nd of 19 1951. Now, the reason Shoghi Effendi sends out the cablegram on January 9th of 1951, laying out the four-stage plan of this first International Baha'i Council that's embryonic, that will go through 4 stages and eventually become the world-recognized Universal House of Justice, is because that is his successor. Shoghi Effendi's son, his lineal successor, is a non-biological son. The son of Shoghi Effendi is the Universal House of Justice. It's not any one person. So this is why Shoghi Effendi later, he announces his successor that he set up in January 9th of 1951, meaning the institution of the Universal House of Justice, head and body both, as explained in the Will and Testament, the executive and the legislative branches, the wood and the iron working together. It's because he announces welcoming Abdul-Baha's son as the president on May 2nd and starts to appoint the other members. These people individually are not the successor to Shoghi Effendi. Technically speaking, Mason Remy is not the successor to Shoghi Effendi at all. Mason Remy is the successor to Abdul-Baha on the throne of David only. But because of the dichotomy, Shoghi Effendi is the successor to Abdul-Baha that inherited the divine guidance of the conferred infallibility. And this conferred infallibility passes from Shoghi Effendi to the council. So the Baha'is, at the time of Shoghi Effendi's passing, Ruia Khanum in the hand, were aware of the successorship. And like other clergy in the past, had leadership ambitions. And Abdul-Baha and Baha'u'llah are clear in their writings. It states that the hands of the cause of God are the inheritors of nothing. That when the guardian dies, his hands die with him. So the moment that Shoghi Effendi died on November 4th of 1957, his hands ceased to exist. So when they declared that they were still the hands of the cause of God after his passing, and that the people should turn to them who would make the decisions, this led the people astray from the final instructions in the Will and Testament of Abdul-Baha. On the last page in section 3, it states that after Abdul-Baha, we should turn to the center of the cause of God, Shoghi Effendi, and after him, to the House of Justice. Well, the people didn't turn to the House of Justice. After Shoghi Effendi, they turned to Ruia Khanum in the hands. And then they claimed they had an interregnum because they weren't infallible. Well, because they admit they're not infallible and they claim they have this interregnum, this is where they all got lost. Whereas Shoghi Effendi's infallible successor existed in the world 7 years before his passing, with an overlap from 1951 to 1957. The moment Shoghi Effendi took his last breath and ascended into the Abha kingdom, that First International Baha'i Council was his successor, and Mason Remy and Ruia Khanum, who was a member on it, should have worked together and called a meeting of that first IBC. Had they done that, and had that IBC announced it was the Universal House of Justice, they would have also recognized the president of that being Abdul-Baha's son. Now, the main reason the people were led to astray to reject Mason is they thought he was not an Agsan. The Will and Testament states that the president of the House of Justice must be a Gusan, a branch, or an Agsan, branches plural, meaning must be in the male family line through Baha'u'llah and Abdul-Baha as an Agsan. Well, Mason Remy is an Agsan, it turns out. That Shoghi Effendi wrote this on the packet of Mason Remy's inheritance of the hair and the blood of Baha'u'llah being symbolic of him receiving the bloodline of King David, and the hair being the headship of the Universal House of Justice. And on there, signed by Shoghi Effendi and dated by him March of 1922, he states that this is the inheritance that he's giving to Abdul-Baha's dear son. And he puts that in quotation marks in English, dear son in quotes. Well, because it's in quotes, when we translate it back into Persian, it's just saying that he is giving this inheritance to Abdul-Baha's dear Agsan. That Abdul-Baha didn't speak English, and in his tablets and writings, when he referred to Mason as his son, or his dear son, or my beloved son, or the son of the kingdom, and in these type of ways, this is Abdul-Baha had written that Mason was his dear Agsan, meaning a legal branch. And an adopted son has all the rights and privileges of a natural son, including the legal inheritance of the throne line that succeeds Abdul-Baha. So the First International Baha'i Council never took a breath. It was never born into the world. It never had a meeting, and it died in embryo. In one of the pilgrim's notes in Shoghi Effendi, they asked him about the 10-year plan and the building of the administration and the 4-stage plan of how this first IBC will evolve. And he stated that that because of world events and things that are taking place, that the greater covenant might intervene to be able to establish that this birth of justice, which fulfills prophecy also in the greater covenant, but is the successor in the lesser covenant of Baha'u'llah, by which we all receive joint heirship. The believers of iron and the rod of wood together as a unified community that's golden. And of course, we follow the golden rule in our covenant of friendship to do even better unto those as they would do unto us. So this hijacking resulted in a split, and Mason Remy was forced to be exiled from the land and Haifa, where he'd been living and working with Shoghi Effendi, and he came to America, and then he moved the son that he adopted, Joseph Pepe Remy Agsan, to Florence, Italy, and the cause of God was kind of dormant during a 40-year prophesied period. And then on January 9th of 1951, Dr. Leland Jensen, the establisher of the Baha'i faith, reestablished Shoghi Effendi's plan. That it had taken us that long to reconstruct and find all of the writings and documents that pertained to the tablets of the divine plan and the international teaching effort and the successorship of the covenant that Shoghi Effendi had compiled and put together. And he had these in 2 manila envelopes. One of them was signed in Arabic on the outside and addressed to Mason Remy. And these were left in the apartment that Shoghi Effendi owned in France, where he used to stay with Ruia Khanum. And when Shoghi Effendi passed on in London, Ruia Khanum sent a servant back to France to get these packets of these 2 packets that Shoghi Effendi had left in the safe there, and 2 large amounts of 100,000-pound note total in British currency. And when he came back to London with the money and the 2 envelopes, he witnessed Ruia Khanum take these 2 manila envelopes that had these instructions in them compiled all together, and she threw them in the fire. And this was discovered by investigative reporters. At the time I met them, they were working out of Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States of America, and they're going to come out with a book that explains how Ruia Khanum really destroyed the momentum that the Baha'i faith had, up until the time of the passing of Shoghi Effendi, and derailed the people from recognizing Shoghi Effendi's true, infallible successor, his son, his lineal descendant, being the first International Baha'i Council that was already in the world 7 years before he ascended and passed on in London. Well, we didn't know about any of this. We just found out about some of that story I told you when I met with the investigative reporter a few years ago, and he says his book is slated to come out maybe around the year 2026. We're hoping to see that. And what we were doing was working on Baha'u'llah's genealogy, which Dr. Grover Gonzalez and some of the Hands of the Cause of God were working on during the lifetime of Shoghi Effendi. And this work had to do with discovering the ancestors of Baha'u'llah who were seated upon the throne of David that was brought into exile when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem. It was brought into Babylon, and later Cyrus the Great brought this into Persia, and the throne of King David relocated outside of the city of Tehran in the province of Manzindaran. And these were the exilarchs, the exiled monarchs of King David. And the most famous one of these is the exilarch Bostanai. Well, we didn't want to just have a list of names who are the ancestors of Baha'u'llah, that these exilarchs, being of the Jewish faith, preserved the names, the entitlements, the names, the professions, and the entitlements of every single one of the descendants of David. And these are historical figures. You can go back through history and find where they lived and what they did, and what their profession was, and what was happening in the region where they were and in the world at their time. And that was the historical work we were doing on this genealogy of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha from the ancient line of King David and Solomon and the Rosh Galutha, the Ras al-Jalud, the exiled monarchs of King David. While we were doing this, we were working in New York in the public library system there and at the Jewish law libraries and other institutes, and we came across Mason Remy's writings to the state government of the state of Israel. And in those writings, he talks quite extensively about Shoghi Effendi's plan for this first International Baha'i Council to evolve through these 4 stages. And as we investigated Shoghi Effendi's writings that he published during his lifetime, including his cablegrams, we were able to reconstruct and regather up and recollect all of his writings that pertain to the covenant and the successorship that were in that packet that Rehoboam threw away and to the fire and had burned. When that, after we had the divine plan, then with the authority of coming in the greater covenant by fulfilling the prophesied name, the prophesied date, the prophesied address, and the prophesied mission, the establisher of the Baha'i faith that Abdul Baha prophesied of in some answered questions under the title The Seventh Angel, then reestablished the International Baha'i Council Universal House of Justice on January 9th of 1991. And he, with his authority, appointed all of the members of it, the way Shoghi Effendi appointed the body of the first IBC, and they represented the rod of iron. And then he also welcomed Abdul Baha's great-grandson and his successor, myself, as the presidents. And at the time Pepe was alive, I was the heir apparent. He welcomed myself and Pepe as the president and heir apparent of that second International Baha'i Council. And it's still in its appointed stage of existence right now. But unlike the first one, it had a meeting. And after January 9th of 1991, it was on March 2nd of 1991, on a Sunday night, the National Baha'i Council, the son of Shoghi Effendi, took its first breath and had its first meeting. And we've been meeting regularly ever since that time, all the way up till today, from 1991 to the present. What people don't really seem to understand is that the heroic age of the Baha'i faith lasted from 1844 to 1921. So we're at this centenary, or the 100-year anniversary this year in 2021 of the heroic age. After this, Shoghi Effendi described his ministry as an iron age, and he called it this age of transition. And then he said after the Iron Age would come the Golden Age. And the reason it's the Golden Age is that in the year 2001, this Second International Baha'i Council was projected to all the people of the world with the unfurling of the genealogy of Baha'u'llah 10 days during the time of the 9/11 to 9/21, 2001, and the proclamation of the true Universal House of Justice of Baha'u'llah was made known to all the people of the world, and it's symbolized again by this rod of gold. Myself being the branch of wood, who's the executive and chair of the council, and the other members being the rod of iron, forming this rod of gold. So the Baha'i faith, as of the year 2001 AD, is in the golden age of the Baha'i faith. But we're not in the golden age of world civilization. We're still in an heroic age of world civilization. And this has to do with the catastrophes and the calamities that are coming upon all the people of the world with this global pandemic, the call for justice and fairness for all, the need for a system of worldwide agriculture that's the foundation of society, that's environmentally friendly, clean air, clean water, clean ways of getting energy, and all of these things. But because we're in the calamitous part of this, it's the heroic age of civilization for the world. And when this catastrophe reaches its breaking point and the people are finally able to come together internationally and cooperate, we will enter into the Iron Age of global civilization, an age of transition. And this is when the Supreme Tribunal will be established and elected and will bring peace to the world through justice. Then, as all the people of the world become spiritual and have their transformation into the spiritual and everlasting image of God, meaning taking on the qualities and attributes of God, the universal house of justice will effloresce and we will enter into the golden age of world civilization. And so the development of the world at large follows the pattern of the heroic age, the transition age, and the golden age that appeared in the Baha'i faith and in the Baha'i community, but on a global scale in about this amount of time synchronized after this, which is about 149 years. So there's about a 149-year pattern between what the history of the Baha'i faith went through, heroic age, iron age, transition, and golden age of 2001, and the heroic age of world civilization and the iron transitionary stage of world civilization and the golden age of world civilization that we're looking forward to. So this International Baha'i Council is established and firm and secure. Now these prophecies are so clear, Abdul Baha indicated, as quoted in Baha'u'llah in the New Era, that the Greater Covenant would intervene. He stated that there was a prophecy at the end of the book of Daniel of 1,335 years. When we add these to the victory of Muhammad in 628 AD, at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in April, we get Rizwan, or April 21st of 1963. And this is the date that Shoghi Effendi was talking about when he said the Greater Covenant would intervene. And it did, because that was the day of the appearance of the seventh angel mentioned in the book Some Answered Questions. Now, this prophecy is so clear that the mainstream group, the Sands Guardians, out of Haifa, that the Hands have set up, have actually removed the prophecy of the seventh angel from the English translation of Some Answered Questions. And whereas before it said the seventh angel is a human being who will arise in the future and establish the kingdom. And Dr. Leland Jensen fulfills that role, absolutely, by his prophesied name, his prophesied date, his prophesied address, and his prophesied mission. They removed this to saying that the seventh, that it's just not there, and you can read it for yourself. And they did this in 2015. They've also retranslated the 7 valleys and the 4 valleys, stuff like this. For instance, in the 4th valley of Baha'u'llah, he talks in the 1st valley, he quotes, and he says that at this valley, the self is not to be shunned, but loved. It's the self of God standing within you with sunnah, laws, customs, traditions, characteristics, demeanor, however you want to translate sunnah. Well, they translated it into saying the self is not to be shunned but beloved. And then it says, because the self of God pervadeth all his laws. Now, this is completely contrary to the hidden words. It says that the self of God appearing within you with sunnah. And this is what it says in the hidden words. It says that thy heart is my home, sanctify it for my descent. Thy spirit, my place of revelation, cleanse it for my manifestation. Baha'u'llah's revelation of the oneness of humanity establishes and supercharges all of the mystic and spiritual and religious teachings of all of the manifestations of God and greater and less that appeared in the past, that taught the inner mystical experience of God appearing, the presence of God or Shekinah appearing through the rays of the Holy Spirit within the subjective life world of the individual person who is now a stone, a living stone in the temple of God, and an equal member in the body of God, all of the other members in the body or temple of God. And this is the true universal house of justice. The universal house of justice is not a separate entity from the Bahai people and Bahai believers that's over there like some golden calf that we have to bow down before, that's going to tell us and micromanage our lives and tell us how it is and force us to practice taqlid and blind fellowship of that. No, 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 no. The Baha'i system includes everybody in the house of justice as an equal member in the body of God, where we all have a vote of one. And we elect our local councils, we call them, instead of a house of justice, call them councils right now, our national councils, and the international council still appointed. But as we go through the next 3 phases of Shoghi Effendi's constitution, this institution will become elected as the supreme tribunal, and it will bring peace to the world. It was not meant to be elected just by the Baha'i people and become the head of some religious community. No, the Baha'u'llah's Universal House of Justice is meant to be the legislative and judicial branches of the international government that will actually bring material peace to the world. That Shoghi Effendi states will happen sometime in the future, maybe quite a while off, where after the lesser peace, the Baha'i faith in the most great peace would become the state religion of sovereign powers. But not the way we have it today. It just means that all the people will be Baha'is, and as such, any government that they set up would be the Baha'i state, because they themselves would be the Baha'i people. But meanwhile, we have an overlap. We have people who are enjoying the kingdom of God on earth now, are enjoying the oneness of humanity, and having international fellowship through the power of the covenant of friendship by meeting the rest of the people around the world that are also cognizant of who the particular person is who inherited David's throne today, now. And through this, they're able to recognize the successor of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi, which is the true universal house of justice. And just the fact that it exists and it's in the world is enough for the individual people to unlock their inner potential and spiritual mystery and receive their rays of the Holy Spirit by also teaching the faith and living the life. So that's kind of a more roundabout explanation of that. I wanted to get into some of these details, because if I just state that, well, we're just a different house of justice than the one in Haifa, because we have the Davidic king and they don't, that's not what's really different. What's different is the true universal house of justice, which is symbolized by a rod of gold or like a shepherd's staff, is not a golden calf that we're mounting our golden earrings down to bow down and worship, and then golden earrings being symbolic of doing whatever it says. And of course, it completes it back. It doesn't guide, in this type of a way. But it says in the book of Revelations that we'll follow the Lamb wherever it shall go. And when Moses was a shepherd and one of his sheep, one of his lamb, the little lamb got lost, he followed it. And it led him into the grove where the burning bush was then experienced by Moses. So we have guidance from the Lamb of God today, which is symbolized by the station of Jesus, who's both the herald of the kingdom and its establisher, that's able to mediate this covenant through our intellect. So by using our intellect, we can read the provisions of the will and testament for ourselves as individuals and see the truth with our own eyes and not through the eyes of our neighbor, that at the end of the will and testament, it says to turn to is called Shoghi Effendi, and then the House of Justice. And then it says, and he turns to whatsoever else is indeed in grievous error. So when the masses of the people failed to read the will and testament, failed to use the criteria in it to recognize the successor being the House of Justice, failed to see that Masonry was the Agsan son of Abdul Baha, who was duly appointed by Abdul Baha in his lifetime, and welcomed by Shoghi Effendi as the first president of the first IBC, and given the inheritance from Shoghi Effendi as the infallible executor of Abdul Baha's state, they no longer knew how to recognize the true universal House of Justice. So we have a need for the gospel of the kingdom of Christ. The meaning of the word Christ in the anointed and sperm descendant King David, Christ coming from the Greek word Christos, as the word Messiah in Hebrew means the one, and understanding that Baha'u'llah fulfills prophecy for the second coming of Christ, anointed male sperm descendant of David that's prophesied of. Well, if the lineage of King David came to an end after the coming of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha, then Baha'u'llah can't be the Christ, because the prophecy in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, especially in the literature of the Jews and the covenants of the Old and New Testament and the Quran, where David and Solomon are stated to be the caliphate, or the successorship to the throne that even Adam had, then Baha'u'llah would be false. Because in order to bring the kingdom, it includes the integral component of the point of unity, which is the continuation of the throne line of David that is to last forever. So the mainstream Baha'i group and some of the other pseudo groups are unable to teach the Baha'i faith to the people of the world, to the ocean of the sea of humanity, who are mostly Jews, Christians, and Muslims, because the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims are waiting for Christ to come, or a King Messiah. And this person will be seated on the throne of David and establish a real government upon the earth, and the throne line of David will continue after the coming of this personage for 5,000 centuries. So if the hands and the mainstream group teach that Bada changed his mind or broke his covenant, and the guardianship came to an end, they're saying the throne line of King David came to an end. And if that's true, then Baha'u'llah is false. He's not the second coming of Christ. He's not the King Messiah of the Jews. But it's true that the throne line of King David didn't end, and Baha'u'llah does fulfill these prophecies. So by denying the presidency of the House of Justice, which is an integral part of Baha'u'llah's revelation of the oneness of humanity, or a universal House of Justice, which we're all members of, that it's elected out of us, having votes of one. So it's an extension of ourselves, and we are an extension of it. Everything is connected in the oneness of creation, and all things are alive. This is the human part of the divine plan to eventually elect our own universal House of Justice internationally in the form of the Supreme Tribunal that will bring peace to the world. So they created a situation where they can't teach that Baha'u'llah is that Senate King David that the whole world's waiting for, because then they'd have egg on their face now. Because back in the 50s, when they didn't understand all this and they said it ended, now people can see in hindsight that they turned to something else, and whatsoever else would lead them into grievous error. So this centenary of the covenant, this first 100 years of the operating workings of the will and testament, demonstrates the humility of God. God lets the people do whatever they want to the messengers and prophets that he sends to them. Baha'u'llah describes this in one of his tablets, where he talks about in one day he was exiled like Abraham, beheaded like John the Baptist, crucified like Jesus, beheaded like Imam Hussein, riddled with bullets like the Bab, and then of course he was imprisoned and tortured and banished for 40 years. God lets the people do whatever they want to his successors and to the believers of the success of the manifestations. And in the 100 years, we've seen they did whatever they wanted to Abdul Baha, to Shoghi Effendi, Mason, and Pepe wound up being isolated in exile in Florence, Italy. So it's not until today, after the year 2001, that the community is actually functioning on par with their fellow believer, who isn't any more or less infallible than anybody else in and of himself, the lineage holder of David today, that we have this golden functioning in our community. So these questions, while they seem, straightforward, they involve a lot of deep issues that concern all the people of the world. So we're the only ones in the world that have a message for the people of the world. And the message is, and this goes to Jews, Christians, Muslims, Baha'is, and the people of the East have different terms for this, like the Kalki kings and Shambhala kingdom. But in the Western tradition and prophecy, the reason and the function and the purpose of the descendant of David being the president of Baha'u'llah's Universal House of Justice is so we can recognize the true Universal House of Justice of Baha'u'llah from fakes, frauds, and imitations. And this way the people won't turn to something else and they won't be led astray. By turning to the true one, they're turning to their true selves and receiving their own inheritance in the kingdom. And to turn away from this and to turn to the hands, they deprive themselves of the divine guidance promised in the covenant if we remain firm in this covenant, which has a dual successorship of all of the people of the world being the spiritual successors of iron and the legal and material genealogical successor of wood, that provides a point of unity in this equation and experiment that God has given us for us choosing to use the charter of the kingdom, the will and testament of Abdul Baha, to set up our own local communities, national communities, and an international solution to the problems of our global village that faces us today. In America, Israel, Iran, and Russia play prominent in the world theater of global events and how this is going to be brought about. One of the problems of rivalry between the different countries is them being sacred or being a holy land. Israel is considered the Holy Land for Jews and Christians and Muslims. And Mecca is considered a holy land for Muslims. Well, today, because of the appearance of Baha'u'llah, the nation of Iran has been elevated and heightened to being a holy land of great significance, as well as Baghdad, Iraq, just as significant as Jerusalem, Haifa, and Mecca and Medina. And this is going to become prominent, and it creates three main places in that part of the world that will bring stability to spiritual, religious, and international relations. Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran being these three places where these manifestations of God came to. And we know that Adam and Moses are in the Holy Land of Israel. Muhammad appears in Mecca and Medina, and the Bab and Baha'u'llah in Iran and Iraq, as well as Zoroaster. So you've got like 5 out of the 9 manifestations of God that appear in these triple places, with Krishna and Buddha, being east of Iran, and so forth, for a total of the 9 manifestations of God altogether. So as the people of the world recognize the revelation of Baha, the Bab and Baha'u'llah, and as the Iranian people understand Baha'u'llah's revelation to be a transformation of the heart and not a seizure of material government or culture, and preserving individual identity and cultural truths, they'll become elated. And not only is their country elevated to Holy Land status, but the divine economy will shower down upon this, and people who are Christians who like to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem will also wish to make pilgrimages to Tehran and Shiraz and Mecca and Medina. And when people go on hajjs and pilgrimages, they will feel like doing the entire circuit. If somebody comes from China or the United States or Russia and they're going to travel to Jerusalem, they might as well also go to Mecca and Medina and go to Shiraz and Tehran and Baghdad and see these other holy places. And this will bring money and glory to the people because the people appreciate that the teachings came out of that culture. They will honor that culture, preserve that culture, put those people of that culture in their hearts and in the center of their prayers. And this is the type of transformation we're talking about. It's a change of attitude and the removal of religious prejudice so that we can accept the diversity of religious practice and the variety of religious experience that Baha'u'llah has revealed from the time of Rizwan in 1863 in Baghdad, in its way from exile from Tehran to Baghdad to Turkey and then to the Holy Land.